A dull thud of an oar against the side, the smell of cold, salty water, and a question that historians still debate. What pushed thousands of Northerners to leave their homes and rush into stormy seas, knowing that every raid could be their last? Not numbers, but a feeling. Here you stand on the shore. The wind whips your face, and somewhere inside, the same feeling is born that pushed them forward. But there is a detail that will become clear only at the very end of this story, and it is capable of overturning the view on the motives of the Vikings. According to modern researchers, climatic changes of the 8th century and population growth in Scandinavia created pressure on communities, forcing them to seek new lands. Archaeological excavations in Norway show that the number of farmsteads indeed increased, while suitable lands remained the same. These facts provide a dry outline, but an image brings it to life much more vividly, as if the whole country became a cramped boat where each new person pushes another ever closer to the turbulent edge. Precisely such long-distance expeditions would later be called long passages on Nors. That was the name for large seagoing vessels capable of withstanding waves and transporting people and cargo. But first, not the term is important, but the essence. A huge wooden arrow cutting through the ocean's emptiness, and only then the word Nor. For understanding the prerequisites, it is important to also consider social mechanisms. Historians write that Vikings vitally needed status, which was gained not by words, but by actions. In northern sagas, it is mentioned that a young man could not count on recognition until he proved himself in action. But the sagas themselves were recorded much later. Therefore, researchers remind, facts there are intertwined with legends. However, archaeologists confirm that gravestones with rich burials appear precisely where there were centers of trade and sea routes, which means successful raids brought real wealth. A cramped valley, poor soil, and young men who vitally need to show their strength create the image of a taut string. One wrong move, and it will snap, turning into a turbulent current that bursts forth. But to understand how exactly this current found its way, one needs to see how the first strike was prepared, when the sea was still only beginning to draw in the future sea raiders. Before the long shadows of ships fell upon the shores of Britain and Francia, everything began with the quiet of a northern village, where men for years prepared themselves for that very moment of going out to sea. Historians write that by the end of the 8th century, a special system for training young warriors had formed among the Scandinavians. It was not formalized, but it included weapon training, hunting, long hiking routes, and participation in seasonal work. Archaeological finds at settlement sites show a large number of training spearheads and wooden shields, used specifically for exercises, not for war. The fact is known, but the feeling it evokes is much stronger, as if the entire village resembled a forge, where each youth slowly heated up to the required temperature before being released into the world. The main instrument of preparation was called huskarls. These were experienced warrior retainers who trained the young. But first, their role is important, not the word. Mentors who, like stonemasons, chipped away everything superfluous from the future fighter, and only then does the name huskarls itself sound. Some historians specify that such a path took several years, and its outcome was participation in local skirmishes between Scandinavian clans. This was not full-scale warfare, but it allowed for gaining real experience. Sagas mention similar clashes, but the details themselves within them may be embellished. Archaeological studies confirm traces of small battles around settlements, where damaged weapons and remnants of fortified sites are found. They are like scars on the country's skin, showing how often strength was tested against each other here. But another aspect is far more important, the economic one. In the northern regions, crop yields were low, and winters were long. Historians note that families prepared provisions almost year-round, and an extra mouth became a problem. For a young man, this meant the necessity either to expand the family's lands, or to acquire wealth, or to go sailing. The image is simple, as if every year the harsh winter crossed out those who had not managed to earn their place at the table. It is at this moment that the main instrument of future expeditions begins to manifest. Long, light hulls of ships, carved from oak or pine, allowed Vikings to travel both by sea and by rivers. Archaeologists have found remains of several shipyards where such vessels were built, and traces of tools indicating the high skill of the craftsmen. Modern researchers say that building one ship required wood equivalent to several tens of cubic meters and the labor of a team of dozens of people. But dry figures fade before the image, as if the very land of Scandinavia, trees, stones, and cold wind, united to create a machine capable of crossing half the world. This ship's framework formed the main strategy of the Vikings. Their strikes were lightning fast, and their retreat routes were quick. What we would later call sea raids then was rather the movement of a living organism, which could appear anywhere. But to realize how this preparation transformed into the first real strike, one needs to see the very moment of departure. That very one when the taut string of the northern lands abruptly snapped towards foreign shores. When the day of departure arrived, everything changed instantly. The village, which yesterday hummed with voices and the sound of axes, now fell silent, as if nature itself held its breath. Historians write that the first major Viking expeditions of the late 8th century began in the late spring, when rivers freed themselves from ice, and days became long enough for sea passages. Archaeological data from the coasts of Norway confirm traces of seasonal shipyards, where ships were launched precisely in these months. But the feeling acts much more strongly than facts, as if spring itself opened doors, behind which a completely different life began. At this moment, the order of command on the ship became especially important. It was embodied by people whose role was first felt in every movement of the crew, and only then was their name called. Helmsmen, whom Scandinavians called styrmen. They stood not at the helm itself, like the captain of a modern vessel, but closer to the middle, holding on to the long side rudder, as if gripping the spine of a living beast they were to control. Historians note that each ship could carry several dozens of people. According to researchers' estimates, early models could accommodate about 3 dozen or a little more warriors, although precise numbers depended on the type of vessel. These people had to work as rowers, fighters, and scouts, performing functions that today would be distributed among different specialists. On many ships, there was no room for extra possessions. Every item had significance. The image here is obvious, as if in a gigantic beast where each bone supports another, and if one breaks, the entire body perishes. Before the start of the expedition, captains gathered a council, which historians call a thing. This is an assembly of free men, capable of making decisions about the route, plunder, and distribution of risks. But the essence is more important than the word. A circle of people who together decided where the ship would go, and only then, the term thing. Unlike later monarchical structures, here everything depended on agreement. And this added tension. Each participant was not just a cog, but a living part of the decision. When the ships were pushed into the water, a ritual began that is rarely described directly in sources, but is confirmed by ethnographers and historians. Men touched the side with their palm or the hilt of a weapon. This was not a religious act in the strict sense, but resembled a modern athlete's gesture before a start. And the image here is especially vivid, as if each poured a drop of their own courage into the ship. The first stage of the journey passed along the coasts, where Vikings could drop anchor, wait out bad weather, or replenish water supplies. Archaeological finds at stopping points indicate traces of temporary camps, charred bones, and stone hearths that could have belonged to such passages. But the sea almost always dictated its own terms. The wind could push ships aside for several days, extending a journey that under ideal conditions would have taken less than a week. This contrast, broad hopes and narrow possibilities, turned each departure into a struggle with unpredictability. When the horizon disappeared in the fog and only the rhythm of oars remained, the main test began. the passage to foreign shores, where every mistake could mean destruction. But it was there that the famous element of surprise was born, thanks to which the first raids became legends, written about by monks and feared by entire kingdoms. To understand how this strike was delivered, one must see what happened at the moment when the walls of Lindisfarne first appeared on the water. When the silhouettes of Lindisfarne emerged in the distant fog, the sea already ceased to be an ally. It became a stage on which the Vikings were to play the first true act of their new history. Historians note that the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery occurred at the end of the 8th century, and it was this episode that European chroniclers described as the beginning of the Viking Age. Monks wrote of the sea blackening with ships, though modern researchers consider this a figurative exaggeration. Most likely there were few ships, no more than a few dozen. But this fact pales before the emotional picture left by eyewitnesses, the cries of gulls, the ringing of the bell, and the appearance of people whose resolve was stronger than the fear of death. Here, especially important becomes the method of landing, which would later be called a shore breakthrough, a rapid driving of the ship onto shallow water, so that warriors could instantly disembark onto land. But first, the action is important, the movement. When the hull of the vessel crashes into the sand with an impact, as if releasing outwards the tension of the entire passage, and only then the term shore breakthrough. Such a method allowed the Vikings to appear almost silently and without warning, which made their strikes especially dangerous for unprepared communities. Monastic sources wrote that the warriors moved swiftly and cohesively. According to modern estimates, their weaponry included spears, axes, and shields. Archaeologists found such items in the burials of Northerners, dated to the same time. The weight of a shield could reach several kilograms, but the main thing was the technique. Historians say that Vikings used a dense formation, which resembled a living wall. One type of such a formation would later be called a shield wall. But first, the image, a line of people, which moves as a single organism, deflecting blows and pushing through any weakness of the enemy. The strike on Lindisfarne was not just a pillaging, it was a signal. Monks wrote that the fury of the northern pagans struck suddenly, and fear of them began to spread along the coast as quickly as smoke. But the dry lines of chroniclers pale before the image, a small detachment which tears apart the familiar world like lightning striking a dry tree. And yet historians emphasize that this raid was not something monstrously unique for that time. Pirate raids existed all along the coast of Europe, and Vikings only added a new force to this world. However, their main weapon was speed. They could appear in one place in the morning and by evening disappear beyond the horizon. Archaeological studies of encampments on British shores show minimal traces of prolonged stay. Fire pits, a little charred wood, fragments of belts. All this indicates that the Vikings did not linger longer than necessary. Precisely this manner of action made their name a legend, although they themselves then still did not realize the scale of the future. For them, it was merely the first step towards wealth, glory, and recognition. But rumors reaching the shores about easy plunder, about the jewels of church vessels, and about the helplessness of monasteries began to melt the ice in the hearts of those who still hesitated. And thus a new flow of people prepared to move to sea, and the strikes would become much more powerful than the one seen by the walls of Lindisfarne. After Lindisfarne, the world could no longer return to its former rhythm. Rumors spread faster than ships, and every kingdom along the coast began to feel as if someone's hand was hiding in the fog, ready to deliver a new blow. Historians note that soon after the first raids, Vikings began to act more organized. They gathered large detachments, uniting people from different fjords. Modern researchers believe that in the early 9th century such formations could number several hundred warriors, although precise figures remain debatable. But the picture is more important, as if the northern lands opened a huge dam from which poured streams of young men eager to test themselves. During this period, the mechanism of plunder distribution acquired special significance. It was first felt as an internal regularity of the expedition, and only then was it called by the word jarl, a chieftain who led the raid and determined the share of each participant. But first and foremost, the role itself is important, a person who decided who returned home as a hero and who remained on the periphery of society. Historical descriptions mention that plunder was divided according to merit, and even the simplest warriors could receive a share of silver. Archaeological finds in Scandinavia confirm this. Hoards from this time often contained silver bracelets with characteristic breaks. They could be broken into pieces as a peculiar equivalent of money. With the intensification of raids, tactics also changed. Historians write that Vikings acted not only from the sea. They used rivers as roads, allowing their light ships to penetrate deep into the territory. The remains of ships found in Danish bogs and Norwegian fjords confirmed the shallow draft of the vessels, thanks to which they could pass where heavier boats would have gotten stuck. The meaning of this fact is simple. Vikings turned the landscape of Europe into their own network of routes. The image that is born here is almost cinematic, as if not river waters flow through the veins of the continent, but the steel lines of their routes. When detachments became larger, they required coordination. Historians mention that sound horns were used for transmitting signals, but the feeling is more important, a low, vibrating sound that penetrates to the bones, making everyone know it's time to move. And only then the term that would later be established as a war horn. Its sound could mean everything: attack, assembly, alarm. For those who heard it for the first time, it was like the roar of a huge beast emerging from the forest. The first major raids showed a surprising advantage of the Vikings, their ability to change strategy depending on the terrain. Chronicles write that the Northerners sometimes avoided fortresses and cities, preferring to attack monasteries, trading settlements, and rich estates. But when the target was truly important, they did not hesitate. One such episode concerns attacks on the Frankish coast. Sources say that the Frankish king was forced to fortify ports and introduce additional garrisons. However, archaeological excavations show that many fortifications were still vulnerable to quick raids. The contrast is striking: stone walls against wooden boats, and yet those who move faster win. With the growing scale of expeditions, losses also increased. Historians note that each expedition held risks. Storms could capsize ships, diseases spread in cramped camps, and unsuccessful skirmishes could wipe out an entire detachment. But this only fueled the cult of personal glory. Northerners believed that death in battle was the best outcome, and this idea transformed them into warriors whom fear could hardly stop. The image here is especially powerful, as if each of them stood on the edge of an abyss, but saw not a fall, but an opportunity to soar. Vikings began to build long-term camps in foreign lands. Historians call such camps krud, temporary fortified bases where detachments could winter, repair ships, and prepare new raids. But first, their function is important: a refuge in a foreign world, where the fire of bonfires shortens the night, and walls hastily built from wood and earth become the only defense. Archaeological finds in England and Ireland confirm the presence of such camps. Remains of earthen ramparts, traces of forges, fragments of weapons. They look as if someone in a hurry created small islands of Scandinavia amidst hostile land. Monasteries, cities, trade centers, everything became a target. Chronicles often describe attacks from the perspective of terror and destruction, but modern historians emphasize Vikings acted not chaotically, but pragmatically. They chose weak points, planned retreat routes, tried to avoid large armies. Sometimes they even concluded agreements for the payment of silver in exchange for peace. This mechanism would later be called Danegeld, but first it was simply a deal, taking treasures not with a sword, but with a hand outstretched for ransom. However, the further the Vikings ventured into Britain and Frankish lands, the more obvious it became that simple raids were no longer enough. Individual detachments began to unite into entire armies, which could conduct prolonged campaigns. In some cases, historians note the presence of thousands of warriors, although precise figures are still debated. The image of a large-scale movement is inevitable, as if a single storm, gaining strength, uniting many small winds into one destructive torrent. And yet, even this storm was not the peak of their power. Ahead awaited a culmination when Vikings not merely plundered shores but began to seize lands, change political borders, and become part of the world they had previously only attacked. It is precisely there that the threads of this story lead, to the moment where a strike ceases to be a raid and transforms into a conquest. When the northern storm transformed into a constant force, Europe understood. Vikings no longer disappeared beyond the horizon after a raid. They stayed. Historians write that in the mid-9th century a new stage began, not just strikes for plunder but a struggle for territories. In England, the first mentions of a great army appear, a united force consisting of detachments from various jarls. Anglo-Saxon chronicles describe these forces as enormous, although modern researchers believe that it could have been a matter of several thousand warriors. But dry figures provide only a shadow of what was happening. The main truth is a feeling. A land accustomed to isolated raids suddenly hears the steps of an entire army, and each step sounds like a heavy heartbeat. It is at this moment that a new type of political force becomes especially important. Its action is felt in how detachments unite, and only then does the term Konungur sound, a military leader whose power is built on successful expeditions and the ability to maintain an alliance. But first, his essence is important, a person who transforms scattered voices of ambition into a single command. Sources recall such leaders cautiously, for chronicles were written by their enemies or descendants. However, archaeological finds confirm the existence of large camps where these united forces could have been located. When Vikings besieged cities, they acted quite differently than during swift raids. Historians note that some attacks continued for weeks. Earthen fortifications were built, supply roads were blocked, and guard duties were organized. This proves that Vikings knew how to conduct prolonged campaigns if the objective required it. In fortifications found in England, traces of systematic work are visible. The ditch was dug evenly and deeply. The rampart was compacted with layers of earth and clay. The image here is almost tangible. People who just recently crashed a ship into the shore now dig the earth, as if wanting to take root in it. However, not all lands were conquered by force. Sometimes weapons gave way to agreement. Anglo-Saxon kings concluded treaties with the Northerners, which allowed them to establish their settlements. Historians call these territories Danelaw, an area where the laws and customs of the Scandinavians became dominant. But first, the idea is important, a space where foreign land ceases to be foreign, and only then the word Danelaw. Archaeological excavations confirm the presence of such settlements, houses built according to Scandinavian models, locally forged weapons but of a northern type, and cemeteries where burial rites differ from Anglo-Saxon ones. These settlements changed the very fabric of society. The Northerners brought new farming methods, trade connections, and shipbuilding skills. Historians write that, in some areas, trade revived, as if blood flowed faster through the veins of lands accustomed to tranquility. But along with this, the Vikings themselves changed. Archaeological data show, after 1 or 2 generations, many families fully integrated, adopting local traditions and creating mixed communities. The image here is almost symbolic, like water that melts ice but changes itself in the process. Meanwhile, on the continent, Frankish lands experienced their own series of clashes. Chronicles describe raids on Paris, where the Northerners tried to use rivers as siege routes. Modern researchers confirm that the siege of Paris lasted long and became one of the largest confrontations of that time. But even this scale did not provide a full answer to the main question: what drove the Vikings? Glory? Gold? The need to find new lands? Historians differ, but archaeology gives us a clue. Hoards of silver, hidden far from their homeland, suggest that their motives were more complex than any single explanation. The furthest expeditions led them to Spain, Italy, and to the east, along Russian rivers to the Black Sea. Chronicles of the eastern lands describe the Northerners as Rus, merchants and warriors who could be both diplomats and mercenaries. However, it is important to understand, different sources speak of different groups of people, and scholars emphasize that this question remains debatable. But the image that emerges is powerful, as if the north wind learned to change direction, not only destroying but also creating bridges between cultures. And yet, the culmination of this story is not in victories or conquests. It is in that moment when the Vikings, once boys in cramped Scandinavian valleys, began to return home not only with plunder, but also with a new understanding of the world. Archaeological excavations show silver artifacts, ornaments of Eastern origin, rare fabrics. All this appeared in Scandinavian homes as a trace of their journeys. This changed society from within. The image? Small fjords in which the light of distant cultures suddenly ignites, as if a reflection of fires seen thousands of kilometers away. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings were no longer merely attackers. They became traders, rulers, mercenaries, landowners. Some of their dynasties entered the history of Europe, and their names forever changed the political map of the continent. Historians write that the descendants of these warriors became kings of England and founders of states. But ancient bones found by archaeologists still bear the traces of people who once raised an oar and faced the cold sea. And now, as the threads of this story intertwine, the moment comes to answer that question, which has sounded from the very beginning. What compelled thousands of Northerners to abandon home and go where every raid could be their last? The answer is not in a single motive and not in a single legend. It is in the human desire to overcome boundaries, those drawn on maps and those that reside within. And here, a personal question inevitably arises for you. Could you, leaving everything, step into the icy water and make a choice that would change not only your destiny, but also the destiny of entire peoples? The history of the Vikings shows that sometimes only those are capable of taking a step forward who are not afraid of storms, but go straight into their heart.